Fantastic. Well, good evening, everybody. I was thinking if you weren't here this morning or you didn't know what was going on this week, you might think I have some exciting props for my sermon. Sorry to disappoint you. There'll be no Oscar nominations or anything like that. These boots excite me. I was wondering who these belong to, but I don't know. We'll see. The owner of the boots, please make their way to the church. The front of the church at the end of the service. This evening, we are continuing in Daniel. Again, if you're new, if you haven't been here before, then you might not realize that we're running through this book of the Old Testament. And I have found it fantastic as we've studied this. An incredible book to look through. And what shocked me, and it really shouldn't shock me, because I know it's true, but it does, is how contemporary it is. How much it relates to our current society. And one of the key themes for this evening's passage, if you were going to take one word to describe it, I think would be the word pride. So before we go any further, I want to read to you just a short little quote from C.S. Lewis about pride. C.S. Lewis, I'm sure you'll know from his Narnia Chronicles, but he wrote loads for adults as well, really on the topic of on Christianity, on Christian theology. And probably his most famous book in that genre is Mere Christianity. And there's a whole chapter devoted to pride, and he calls it the great sin. This is what he says about a man like Belshazzar, who we've just heard in the reading. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. As long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. Now think about that as we go through this evening, as we look at this guy Belshazzar, and we think about his life and this short little episode in chapter 5. Remember C.S. Lewis's words, as you look down on someone or something, you can never look up at something above you. Now, the story kicks off, and you may be a bit confused. Perhaps when the reading was read, if you've been with us through the last 4 chapters, you might have felt a bit disorientated, because it seems that there's this random bloke on the throne. King Belshazzar comes out of nowhere. And for the previous 4 chapters, it's been King Nebuchadnezzar who's been ruling. And you'll see that the author of Daniel has fast-forwarded through history, and we've kind of leapfrogged over one of the other kings, Nabonidus, and we're here with a third king in line after Nebuchadnezzar, which is Belshazzar. And the reason why he's done this is because he wants these 2 stories, chapter 4 about Nebuchadnezzar and chapter 5 about Belshazzar, to go right next to each other. To shoulder up, and you'll see that one of them is very similar to the other. There are similarities right the way through, but there's one key difference. And so as we think back to maybe last week's sermon, if you can remember there, don't worry, we'll summarize it at some point if you weren't there. But if you think back to that sermon and then look at this evening's one, you'll see that there is a key contrast. And that's why we don't hear much about the king that came in between. We just hear about the grandfather and his grandson. And these 2 stories rub up next to each other because they're so similar yet distinct. And you'll see that the story begins in this great wild party. Have your Bibles open in front of you if you've got one, or find it on your phone, or look over your shoulder's neighbour or something, your neighbour's shoulder. They won't mind. What is a shoulder's neighbour? Anyway, it's probably your other shoulder, isn't it, actually? Chapter 5, verse 1, it says this: King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. And this is probably an understatement. I'm told that in Babylonia, it was common for kings to give these massive parties. So imagine the wildest party you've ever been to, times it by 3. Some of us who've had more sheltered churchy lives, maybe times it by 5, just to get the feeling for what this is like. This is a wild party. There was wine flowing, there were women, there was all the things you would expect from this kind of situation. And Nebuchadnezzar gets all his nobles in, his wives, his concubines, everyone, to impress them. This is a wild party. And actually, although these happened often, I think this particular party has a specific reason for it. You see, as that they were drinking wine, as they were dancing and singing and joking, all around the city of Babylon, there were armies amassing. The Medes and the Persians were about to attack. This was a city under siege, and we don't realize it till we get to the end of the chapter. We'll get to it eventually, when we see that this siege is effective and they break in and they take the city. History books tell us about this too. So why were they partying? Why was Belshazzar breaking open the wine cellar and getting drunk? What was this all about? Now, I have 2 theories. You can decide which one you think is more correct. Maybe, in arrogance, in kind of hubris, he thought, well, how can they take us? For all of his life, Babylon had been the empire that had ruled all of the world. This was a man who knew what it was to be in charge, to be the king, for everyone to bow down to him. His grandfather had ruled the world, his father had ruled the world, he rules the world. How could these stupid little Persians and Medes gathering around his city threaten him? And besides, the river Euphrates went straight through the city. They had storehouses full of food. They could last for months and months and months under siege. What's the danger? So maybe in pure arrogance and pride, he was just celebrating, laughing at the attackers outside the city. But I think perhaps more realistic, and as we go through the story, I think this is the kind of character that is unearthed. It is a man who is actually a boy in a crown. He is a weak king compared with his father and his grandfather. In fact, he knows that he's overstretched himself. He knows that the game's up. And so, like many people do when things have got too much for them, they drown their sorrows. He turns to drink. One last fling, and there's a mask that's up. And people don't see this, but here's a king who is already, in his mind, defeated, terrified. And we'll see that as we go through the passage. Now, I'm not going to go to the state for which one of those it was, but probably one or the other. As the armies are outside, here we have a man who is throwing this wild party, getting himself blind drunk. And I think it's probably out of terror. Anyway, something significant happens at the party. Look at verse 2. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father. When you hear that word, it can mean ancestor or kind of grandfather. It's got a bit of a wider meaning. His father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. At this party, as if it wasn't offensive enough to God already, they take the special, precious items from God's temple. You'll remember it from earlier parts of the Bible, that these items were used just in a holy way, in worship to God in the temple. They take them and they use them to get blind drunk. They laugh at God. They laugh at God's people like Daniel. They mock him and they worship other gods. You can imagine if anyone like Daniel around the city had heard what was going on, the kind of emotions going through his body. But here's Belshazzar, shaking his fist at God, maybe sticking two fingers up at God, laughing at the God of the Bible, the God we've come here this evening to worship. And all of this might seem really, really kind of distant from where we are today. There's gods of gold and wood and all these sorts of strange things. The party seems distant and mystical and extravagant and kind of all things which we don't really experience now. This is a different historical context. It seems far away. But actually, if you dig around a bit, I think you find a man with a heart very similar to you or I, perhaps, to the culture in which we live. Here's a man, Belshazzar, who basically is saying to God, I can get by without you. I don't need you. Thank you, God, but no thanks. Do people do that today? I think they probably do. And it's interesting, this idea of the goblets and the other articles from the temple. If you skip back to Daniel chapter 1, interesting little detail. When they were captured by Nebuchadnezzar, this guy's grandfather, what does it say they did with them? Verse 2. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that's Nebuchadnezzar's hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put them in the treasure house of his God. In other words, all these precious things, these remnants of the Israelite religion back in their land were taken and thrown in a cupboard to gather dust in a corner. And we don't hear about them again till chapter 5. And I think this almost sums up or gives us a picture of what life is like for many people living in our country today. There's a kind of vague remnant of Christianity, a vague recollection of God, a vague understanding of Christianity, some kind of parables here and there in the shelves in our mind that we can sort of draw on occasionally, but it's distant, it's in the past. And actually what matters, what comes out of the cupboard regularly are the things that matter to us most, other gods. You know, the gods of money, the gods of success, the gods of power, the gods of pleasure. These are the things to which we bow down. These are the things which we love. These are the things which we worship. And, well, the God of the Bible, he's somewhere in the background gathering dust. And maybe if someone was to take a census and we had to tick a box, we might tick Christian, but I don't know. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's Jedi. Maybe it's atheist. Who knows? And this is the kind of culture I think that many of us are experiencing, well, it's this cultural shift that many of us are realizing is taking place in our country. And many of us perhaps think like that ourselves. We're like Belshazzar. God is something we're not really interested in, something we don't really care about, someone who actually we would laugh at and joke about. That's where we are. Anyway, in all this hilarity, they're all laughing, they're all joking, and God is the butt of the joke, and then God steps in. Look at verse 5 with me. Back in chapter 5, sorry, if you're still in chapter 1. Chapter 5, verse 5. Suddenly the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the wall, on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was frightened, and his knees knocked together, and his legs gave way. Actually, and here's an interesting detail. It can be argued, pretty convincingly, and I'd like to believe it, that his legs gave way is better translated that his kind of lower regions relaxed. He wet himself, okay? So if you want to picture Belshazzar in your mind, picture knees knocking, puddle beneath his feet, terrified like a sheep. This is the man who was life and soul of the party, the guy who was handing out the wine and joking and mocking God, and all of a sudden, in just one verse, he's transformed into this pathetic, empty, broken man in a puddle of his own urine. This is Belshazzar, the great king, the mighty emperor of the world, reduced to nothing. Anyway, verse 7. The king called out for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners to be brought to him, to those wise men of Babylon. Whoever reads the writing on the wall, and he said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever reads the writing on the and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck. He will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. In this whole passage, what God seems to be doing is taking a man who thinks he's everything, a man who thinks he can stand on his own 2 feet, and bringing him down. He's humbling him bit by bit, almost deconstructing this man to show him his own weakness. And do you find that God sometimes does this? When God brings us down, well, what do? We reach out for the things that we can rely on, for the things that prop us up, for our crutches. And in Belshazzar's case, he reaches out for his religion. He gets in all the religious guys, and they're going to sort it out and fix things, maybe give him a message that he can do something about because he's the king. But he brings in these people who he thinks can sort it out and help him, and they're no use. God frustrates him even more, humbles him even more by kicking out the crutches beneath his feet. And actually, this is God being merciful. It may not feel like it when you see this man reduced to a pale, quivering, wetting himself mess. I mean, it doesn't feel kind, does it? But actually, nothing's really changed. This religion that Belshazzar was following is just as useless and hopeless before this event as it is now. God's just showing what it's really like. God's just showing that actually he desperately needs him. That Belshazzar desperately needs to come to God. And if he won't believe it, then he pushes a bit more. He shows, well, look, this religion you're relying on, it's not working. I was thinking about the financial crisis that we've kind of gone through over the last half decade or so, and thinking about the number of people who maybe all their value, all of their identity was in their money, their bank balance, their ability to make money from money, and then almost overnight, for many of those people, that was kicked out from underneath them. And it's really tragic when you read the stories of people who took their lives because, I mean, these aren't people who were on the breadline. These are people who were making millions and now are making, I don't know, hundreds of thousands in a year. But their life came tumbling down and they couldn't cope because the crutch they leaned on was kicked away. And often God will do this. I was thinking for the man perhaps who sacrifices everything for his career, that gives everything for this job which is his, who does all this to the detriment of his family, to the detriment of everything else in his life. Everything else is suffering. Perhaps the kindest thing that God could do would be to take that job from him and to let him see that it wasn't helping him, to humble him, to bring him up. And that's what we see here with Belshazzar. Even the things which he clings to are taken from him until the queen comes in. Look at verse 10 with me. Here's a new character. This is the stuff that Debbie didn't read for us, so we're going to follow the story as it unfolds next. We've got a man completely on his knees before God. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "O king, live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom, like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed with purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Do you remember that there was a king as well who was above Belshazzar? He was his father and he was away traveling or something. So basically we've got the third highest is the next rank that Belshazzar can offer up. Anyway, listen to what Daniel says. Verse 17. "Then Daniel answered the king, 'You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means.'" Now, it's kind of off the topic here of looking at Belshazzar, but just for a moment, if we can kind of step to one side out of the story and hear a bit about Daniel. I was thinking that Daniel's an incredible example to us. You know, as Christians, it's really easy, I think, to duck under the opportunity when it comes for us to share our faith, to kind of dodge things and to duck out. And Daniel just isn't like that. I can see from this passage that he isn't affected, is he, by what King Belshazzar could do for him or what Belshazzar could do to him. He ignores all of that and he's not swayed by it, and he just tells God's message the way that it's been told to him. He understands his responsibility and he gets on with it no matter what the consequences are. And I find that incredibly refreshing and incredibly challenging. You know, I was thinking about before I was a minister here at Lansdowne, and I was a teacher in a school not too far away, and I was thinking about times in the staff room. Now, if you're a teacher, you know staff rooms can be cruel places. If you end up sitting on one of the other tables where people don't talk and you're kind of ousted from the group, there's a real kind of social side to a staff room. And if you put the wrong person's nose out of joint, then you're really excluded from a lot of the social life of a staff room. Now, ours was quite a friendly staff room, but I'd seen other staff rooms. I knew what they could be like. They could be mean places. And actually, when it comes to opportunities where I could say something about my faith, I'm ashamed to say that many times I just avoided them or kind of skirted around the issue rather than saying what needed to be said. And I think probably if I was to dig down and think about it, why it was that I just avoided those opportunities and didn't speak boldly like Daniel, it was probably for fear of what the kind of, I don't know, social ringleader sounds bad, doesn't it? But social kind of ringleader would do. I mean, I would be kind of excluded. If one person doesn't like you so much, then others don't talk to you. You're kind of just gently pushed away from friendships and that kind of stuff. And I'm a people pleaser. I like people to like me. Most of us are, aren't we? And so that simple threat of, well, if you speak up for Jesus, they might not like you so much, that was powerful to me. But Daniel doesn't listen to that. Daniel is bold despite what people could do for him. And he wasn't going to be just pushed out of a social group. Daniel was going to have his head chopped off if he said the wrong thing to the emperor of the known world. And on the other side of things, Daniel could have seen himself promoted to the third highest position in the entire world, as it were, if he said the right thing. He could sugarcoat that message and make it sound so lovely to the king that the king was going to promote him, I don't know, even higher if it's possible. But he didn't. Daniel told it straight. He said exactly what God had said to him to say. He didn't change it one way or the other. And I find that really challenging. So perhaps as we go out of here and we get these opportunities to speak for Jesus, let's take them. Let's grab hold of them like Daniel. Let's realize that we fear God above everybody else and not miss those opportunities that he gives us, despite what people might do for us or what they might do to us. Anyway, back into the story. And Daniel answers the king. Look at verse 18 with me. And what he does is he gives them a history lesson. This is where if you missed last week, you're not in too much trouble, because he basically summarizes chapter 4 here in a couple of verses. So you'll be all up to speed. Verse 18, O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. And those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. So basically, it's what Paul said at the start. There is one God in heaven, but that God can give authority to people. And Nebuchadnezzar was made great, but only because of God. But, says verse 20, when his heart became arrogant, and this is most of chapter 4, and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes. Basically, chapter 4 tells us Nebuchadnezzar got so overwhelmed with pride, so arrogant, thinking that this was all from him, that God had to bring him low. And so God, we see here, makes him like an animal almost. He's out in the wild, he's lost his mind, Peter was talking about last week. And maybe for some of the detail, listen back to the sermon from last Sunday. But when he realized that God was great and he wasn't, when he turned and looked to God, everything was returned to how it should be. God lifted him up. God saved him. And that's the story of chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar is brought low, and he looks to God, and God rescues him. But here's the challenge for the young king, for Belshazzar. Look at verse 22. But you, his son or his grandson, O Belshazzar, have not humbled yourself. Though you knew all this, instead you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And this is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez or parsin, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Numbered, weighed, and divided. That's the message for this king. It's over. Finished. A serious wake-up call. And why? Well, it wasn't because he was a really bad sinner. It wasn't because he'd done lots of bad things and had these wild parties and whatever it was with women and wine and all the rest of it. That wasn't it. The real problem for him, and for any of us, is that when we sin like that, we refuse to turn to God. We refuse to turn from our own way of doing things back to him. Did you see that in that section from 22 down to 24? He'd seen all this. He'd seen his granddad going completely insane and then be restored back to his kind of right mind by God. He'd seen all that. Now, if you saw that as a young child, you'd remember that, wouldn't you? That wouldn't be something you'd forget, or the summer when granddad went crazy. You wouldn't forget that, would you? That would stick in your mind. And if then he said to you, well, the reason I'm back in my right mind is because of God, the God of the Israelites. That's why. If he wrote the letter like he did at the end of chapter 4 and passed it around to everyone, his family, his friends, it would have been like a really annoying kind of Christmas letter, but more significant than that. Everyone he knew was on this mailing list, and everyone heard that it was the God of the Bible who had rescued him. It was the God of the Bible who brought him low, and then the God of the Bible who'd restored him. Everyone knew it. Belshazzar, as his grandson, would know it better than anyone. But what did he do? He completely ignored it. He couldn't care less. And we get to this chapter here where he's holding a party and laughing at the God that his granddad used to worship. It's a really sad end to this story. And the biggest problem is that he did not turn back to his God. And so his days are numbered, He's been weighed and he's been found wanting, and his kingdom will be taken from him. His days are up. And again, what does this have to say to us? This stuff seems really far-fetched. It's a long way from our own experience. I mean, who here is likely to be tempted this week to take goblets from the temple and to throw a big party with Babylonian nobles and to drink wine from them? None of us are likely to face that temptation. If you are, then speak to me afterwards. We'll pray for each other and that'll be good. But you're unlikely to face that this week. But what does it say to you? What's this all about? You see, I think when Daniel speaks to him in verse 22 down to verse 24, that challenge which Daniel has for him, I think almost any one of us in this room, I think every one of us probably in this country, in this world, could hear that challenge. The challenge is, God has spoken to you, whether through a person or through a book or through a sermon or through creation itself. God has spoken. You have heard what you're going to do. That's the message here. And for many of us, particularly people here who come from Christian homes, I think the message is even closer to home, isn't it? For Belshazzar, the message was, you saw your granddad. You saw the transformation. You saw the miracle. What are you going to do with it? Maybe for someone here, it's you saw your brother. You saw what he was like before he went to that camp a couple of years back. And then he comes back and it's just instantly different. He's a changed person. And then month on month, year on year, you just see how God is working on him and changing him. And he's never the same again. The way he speaks, the things that matter to him, his relationships, his friendships, the way he's a brother to you, it's all different. But you do nothing about it. You don't start to take God seriously yourself. You just keep on living the same life you lived before. In fact, you get further and further from God, harder and harder against him. That seems to be what happened to Belshazzar. And my fear is that maybe that happens to some people sitting in the pews here at Lansdowne as well. They've seen someone important to them in their life transformed by God, but they do nothing about it. They don't turn back to him themselves. And I don't know, suppose maybe there's someone here who doesn't know any Christians. It's possible. In our country today, there's not as many of us as there used to be. So maybe you've never met a Christian before. Well, even those of us in that circumstance, probably there's a Bible kicking around in your house that you could have read. We're in a country where still there's a vague sense of Christianity. You've got parables stored up here, like we said, things which you can get hold of, a sense of the life of Jesus. And if none of that, you're sitting here this evening listening to a sermon. God is speaking to you. You know, we see this all through the Bible. Look at maybe Romans 1. And we could look there another time. Maybe for your homework, you can have a look at Romans 1. And you see how no one is without excuse, because to every one of us, God has spoken in one way or another. We're all in the same boat. What matters is what we do with that. When God speaks, what will we do? Will we listen to him? Will we turn to him? And the tragedy of this passage is that Belshazzar didn't. Look at the last few verses. Only got 3 left. Verse 29. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Fat lot of good that was, though, because look at verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The whole thing happened exactly as it was predicted by Daniel, exactly as the writing on the wall said. Numbered, weighed and divided. The kingdom's gone. And you know, as a preacher, I don't know, I feel this. Some other preachers may enjoy these kinds of passages. I don't really like preaching passages like this. I was sharing that with the staff earlier this week. I'd much rather preach other passages that have more positive messages. But this is a challenging, hard, difficult message. And I was thinking it's kind of like sort of trying to pull the cord on your grace parachute too early. Like we're in this sermon and I kind of want to go, and then kind of parachute goes, and little New Testament verses float down and everyone feels better and the tension is released and stuff. But I think it would be so much better for us to hold back from pulling the cord and to feel the full force of what this passage is saying. It's saying that we have all heard from God, that every one of us has a responsibility to respond, to start to take him seriously. And most terrifying of all, that there will come a day when it's too late. And the tragedy of Belshazzar is that he didn't do what his grandfather did. These 2 chapters are right next to each other to show the contrast. Nebuchadnezzar was humbled, and he turned to God. Belshazzar was humbled, and he didn't. And the end is clear in verse 30. And so although this seems like a bleak chapter and a sad chapter, behind it I think we see a God full of mercy, a God who every time he tries to humble Belshazzar is doing it out of love. When the Medes and the Persians amassed around the city and the walls were surrounded and the siege was ready to take place, that was out of love to humble this man. When the writing came on the wall and he was terrified, that was to humble this man. When his enchanters and everything he used to lean on to reassure himself and to build himself up was kicked out from underneath him, that was to humble him out of mercy. And when Daniel finally tells him what it means, that is out of love and mercy. Because if he's humbled and if he turned, this story would end so differently. In fact, the best thing that Belshazzar could have done here was to humble himself. I'd love us to read just a short other paragraph from C.S. Lewis. It's a little longer than the last one, but I find him just so insightful on this topic of pride and humility. This is what he says about a God who humbles us. The point is, he wants you to know him, wants to give you himself. And he and you are two things of such a kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will in fact be humble, delightfully humble. Feeling the infinite relief of having for once got rid of all the silly nonsense about your own dignity which has made you restless and unhappy all your life. He is trying to make you humble, Belshazzar. C.S. Lewis doesn't say that. He's trying to make you humble in order to make this moment possible. Trying to take off all the silly, ugly, fancy dress in which we've all got ourselves up and are strutting around like little idiots. C.S. Lewis's words, not mine. It's okay. I wish I had got a bit further with humility myself. If I had, I could probably tell you more about the relief, the comfort of taking the fancy dress off, getting rid of all the false self with all its look at me and aren't I a good boy and all its posing and posturing. To get even near it, even for a moment, is like a drink of cold water to a man in a desert. That's what humility feels like. To say to God, you are big, I am small. To come to a Father who loves you and to turn to him. And that's a challenge for all of us here this evening. I hope that many of us here have already turned to him and know what it means, in part, to humble ourselves before a great God. But I'm convinced there'll be some here this evening who've never done that. Please hear the words of this passage. There will come a day when it's too late. Make that decision now. In the book of Hebrews it says, today if you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Now the chapter ends there. But just imagine, if Belshazzar had turned back to God, who would he have found? You ever wondered that? What kind of God would he have found? I just want to read to you a few words from Luke chapter 15. It's a familiar parable. Don't worry about turning there. The story of a lost son. And this could be Belshazzar. He's run away. He's far away. He's living a life that God wouldn't want him to live. And then reduced to nothing, he comes back. And what does he find? But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. And the son says some stuff to try and make it better. But the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and he is alive again. He was lost and he is found. So they began to celebrate. That's the kind of God that Belshazzar would have found if only he turned back. I mean, he had mountains of sins, but that wasn't too much for God. God can save big sinners. We've all seen that in our own lives. But if we turn to him, we find a Father who loves us, who runs to meet us, who throws his arms around us and forgives us and welcomes us home. It's just a tragedy that Belshazzar never took that step. And so this evening, the challenge is for all of us, whether we know people who need to make that step or whether that's us. This passage is a serious one. And I don't want to water that down, but let's remember the God who we come to, the God who many of us have come to already, who welcomes us, who loves us, and wants to call us home. Let's pray together, and as we do, the musicians will come up. Father, thank you that you are a God that we can call Father. Thank you for the mercy we see in the life of Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you for the mercy that we see even in the life of Belshazzar as you tried to turn him, to humble him, to bring him to nothing so he would turn to you. And Father, I pray for anyone here this evening who hasn't made that step themselves, who's still living a life far from you. I pray that you would soften their heart and you would bring them to yourself. Help them to know that if they were to turn to you this evening, you would run to them with open arms. I pray that each and every one of us would know this love of you, our God and our Father, this evening. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.